Remember when In the Rain made the Dramatics sound like the smoothest men in soul? They were young, sharp, and finally becoming stars. Then, Larry Reid suddenly walked away from music after one horrifying night. Several members passed away, while others ended up doing things none could have imagined. More than 50 years later, let's see what happened to the original Dramatics. And trust me, some of them look nothing like you remember. The story really begins with Larry Squirrel Demps, because he did something almost nobody expected after the Dramatics' success. By 22, the round-faced young singer with the pencil-thin mustache and carefully styled hair wasn't only providing baritone harmonies. He was also helping shape the slides, turns, and splits that made the Dramatics so entertaining to watch on songs like Get Up and Get Down. That restless stage energy fit the nickname Squirrel perfectly, which makes what he eventually chose to do with his life even more surprising. By the early 1980s, he stepped away from regular life with the Dramatics. And instead of turning himself into another solo act, Larry moved toward something far more ordinary: family and education. He returned to school, earned teaching credentials, and spent years working in Detroit public education. That choice makes seeing him in 2026, at 77 years old, especially striking. The hair that once framed his face is largely gone now, with what remains turned gray. The pencil mustache and youthful styling have disappeared with the decades, while glasses and a much older face make him difficult to connect immediately with the agile squirrel in those vintage performances. And naturally, he now moves nothing like his 22-year-old self. Yet Larry never completely escaped the Dramatics story. In fact, the group's name followed him all the way into court, and he was directly involved. The connection went back much further than most fans probably realized. In 1973, Larry, Ron Banks, and Willie Ford were already involved in litigation concerning former members' use of the Dramatics name. A Michigan court determined that the name had belonged to the group's partnership and that the partners shared rights in it rather than one member possessing an exclusive claim. Court records later stated that Demps, Banks, and Ford subsequently bought out the interests of two departing members. Nearly 40 years later, Larry found himself dealing with that name again. After Ron Banks died in 2010, competing claims developed over who could legally use the Dramatics identity. Larry eventually joined L.J. Reynolds as a plaintiff in federal litigation involving Sandra Banks, Ron's widow, and Willie Ford. The case wasn't simply about nostalgia or who had sung which song. It involved trademark rights, contracts, and ownership interests connected to the group name. That is quite a second act for somebody who had already exchanged touring for teaching. Thanks to this matter, Larry didn't completely disappear from public view afterward either. In 2017, at 68, he appeared as himself in TV1's Unsung, the story of the Dramatics. Instead of dancing behind another performance, Larry was now one of the people telling the story, talking about events he had actually lived through as an original member. So by 2026, Larry's life is almost the reverse of the young man preserved in those old clips. At 77, he's long removed from the relentless choreography and touring of his 20s. His working life after the group included an entirely different profession, while his connection to the Dramatics survived through the music, television retrospectives, and even decades of legal history surrounding the group's name. But the story of the Dramatics would soon revolve around a very different kind of presence, one unmistakable voice. Ron Banks had helped form the group in Detroit back in 1964, when he was only about 13, and by 20, the nearly 6'3" singer with the close, processed hair and silky falsetto was already leading What You See Is What You Get into the top 10. A year later, In the Rain reached #1 on the R&B chart, and Ron's voice became part of the soundtrack of the early 1970s. Fast forward to 2009, and that tall, slender boy was now 58. His face was rounder, his hair was shorter and thinning around the front, and gray had spread along the sides. He couldn't possibly look like the young man spinning through those old Dramatics performances anymore, but the group itself was still very much part of his life. Nearly 4 decades after their biggest records, Ron was still performing with them. By then, though, the life waiting for him after the show was very different from the one he'd known as a young soul singer. Ron and his wife, Sandra "Sandy" Banks, had built a large family in Michigan, raising 6 children, 2 sons and 4 daughters. His daughter later remembered a much more ordinary side of the man audiences knew from the Dramatics, a father who made sure his children had clothes, food, and a roof over their heads. And Ron had been doing that while carrying the Dramatics with him for most of his adult life. In November 2009, he performed with the group at Detroit's Motor City Casino. Ron was 58, still singing songs he'd first recorded when he was barely out of his teens. That became his last performance with the Dramatics. There had been a serious warning years earlier. According to his manager, Ron had suffered a stroke roughly 15 years before his death and dealt with health problems afterward. Still, fellow Dramatics singer L.J. Reynolds remembered Ron as upbeat and appearing to be in normal health shortly before March 2010. Then everything happened very quickly. Around noon on March 4, 2010, Ron was at home with his family when he suddenly collapsed. Reynolds said he simply passed out. Billy Wilson of the Motown Alumni Association later said the apparent cause was a massive heart attack. Ron Banks was dead at 58. Just 4 months had passed since that Motor City Casino performance. His funeral was held on March 13th at Greater Grace Temple in Detroit, bringing Ron back to the city where he'd started singing with the Dramatics as a teenager almost 46 years earlier. And that's what makes his story hit differently when In the Rain comes on today. Ron had helped build the Dramatics at about 13, reached the top 10 at 20, and gave us one of the group's most enduring records at 21. He then spent most of the next 4 decades carrying those songs with him. Now, it's time for William "Ouiji" Howard. He was only 20 when the Dramatics finally caught fire in 1971. With his high cheekbones, wide smile, and smooth lead voice, he shared the spotlight on What You See Is What You Get, the record that climbed to number 3 R&B and number 9 pop and finally gave the Detroit group its breakthrough. But just as Ouiji seemed to have found the life he'd been chasing, he was about to lose his place in the group that had made him famous. He left the Dramatics shortly after that first album, and this is where his story becomes much more complicated. Ouiji and Elbert Wilkins formed another lineup and continued performing under the Dramatics name. Ron Banks's group was still using it too, so for several years there were effectively competing versions of the Dramatics on the road. The dispute eventually became a legal battle. Banks's side secured the name, while Howard and Wilkins' group continued under a dramatic experience. Yet while the group fight was messy, Ouiji's home life had once looked remarkably hopeful. He had met Sharon Howard in 1970, and they married in January 1971, when Ouiji was just 20. Sharon later recalled that interracial marriage was still difficult for them socially at the time. Then, What You See Is What You Get became successful. Their finances improved, and the young couple bought a home in Detroit's Rosedale Park. But leaving the Dramatics meant leaving that first explosion of success behind too. Ouiji continued trying to make music. In 1978, Record World was still reviewing him as a former Dramatics lead singer when he released the solo single, You've Been a Part of Me. The voice hadn't disappeared. What had disappeared was the enormous platform around it. Then, surprisingly, the door opened again. In the mid-1980s, Howard returned to the Dramatics. He participated in their reunion period and received vocal credit on Somewhere in Time, reconnecting him with the group more than a decade after the split that had sent them to opposite sides over the name. Sources placed this second stint roughly between 1986 and 1989. By then, Ouiji was approaching 40. The youthful face from 1971 had naturally become leaner and more mature. His hairstyle had changed, and the young singer who had once arrived just as the Dramatics were breaking nationally was now returning as a veteran. But he wouldn't get the long old age that some of his surviving bandmates eventually did. On February 22, 2000, William "Ouiji" Howard died in Bronxville, New York. He was just 49 years old. That number changes the way his timeline feels. Ouiji joined the Dramatics around 1968 to 69, tasted their breakthrough at 20, left in his early 20s, spent years trying to establish music outside the classic lineup, and eventually found his way back. But not everyone who left the Dramatics ever found their way back. For Larry Reid, everything changed before the group had even become famous. He was only 19 in 1967, still baby-faced and clean-shaven with close-cropped hair, when his young tenor led All Because of You to number 43 on Billboard's R&B chart. It was the Dramatics' first real taste of success, and Larry looked like he would be there for everything that followed. But the Larry Reid you would meet decades later had chosen a completely different life. By the time he resurfaced publicly around the 2017 film Detroit, Larry was approaching 70. He was thinner, his youthful face had aged considerably, and he often appeared in a fedora, looking nothing like the 19-year-old singer preserved in those early Dramatics photographs. More importantly, he wasn't spending those years touring the oldies circuit with the group. Larry had turned to the church. After leaving the Dramatics, he moved away from secular professional music and became involved with church choirs, singing and directing gospel music instead. Accounts of his later life continued to identify church music as the place where he eventually found a way to keep using the voice that once seemed destined for an R&B career. And there's a very specific reason his life split in two like that. To understand it, you have to return to July 1967, when Larry was 19 and the Dramatics were still waiting for their big break. The group had been scheduled to perform at Detroit's Fox Theater, on a bill headlined by Martha and the Vandellas. But Detroit was erupting in civil unrest, and the performance was cut short as the theater was evacuated. Larry and 18-year-old Fred Temple, a friend and valet associated with the group, eventually took refuge at the Algiers Motel. What happened there changed Larry's relationship with music. Police and National Guardsmen descended on the motel annex after reports of gunfire. The people inside were subjected to a violent interrogation. Larry survived. Fred Temple didn't. Temple was one of 3 young black men shot and killed during what became known as the Algiers Motel incident. Larry was beaten during the ordeal, and accounts of his life afterward describe him as so deeply affected that he eventually left the Dramatics and abandoned the secular career he'd been building. The Dramatics went on without him. 4 years later, What You See Is What You Get reached the top 10. Then came In the Rain. The group Larry had helped start became the successful soul act he'd once hoped it would become. But Larry was no longer standing there when it happened. For decades, most casual listeners knew the records far better than they knew what had happened to the original lead singer. Then Hollywood found him. Screenwriter Mark Bowl met Reid while researching what eventually became Kathryn Bigelow's Detroit, released in 2017. Actor Algie Smith portrayed Larry, bringing the story of that 19-year-old Dramatics singer to audiences roughly half a century after the Algiers Motel incident. But Larry did something even more unexpected than simply allowing his story to be told. He sang again. Reid joined Algie Smith to record Grow for the movie's soundtrack, putting his voice back on a commercial recording approximately 50 years after the night that had pushed him away from secular music. That's the clearest later-life picture the reliable public record gives us. I wouldn't claim a specific 2026 home address, marriage status, PTSD diagnosis, tremor, or current medical condition without stronger sourcing. The Dramatics were changing quickly in those years, and one of the voices that came next would become almost impossible to imagine those classic records without. Willie Ford had joined the group around 1969, and when In the Rain reached number 1 on the R&B chart in 1972, his deep bass was sitting underneath those harmonies, giving them their unmistakable weight. Broad-built, with a neatly shaped afro and a calm presence behind the others, Willie never needed to fight for the spotlight. The higher voices could soar. His job was to make everything underneath them feel enormous. By the final years of his life, however, Willie was almost unrecognizable from that young man. By 68, he'd grown considerably heavier. The squared afro was gone, his hair had thinned and grayed, and he often appeared in dark glasses and loose-fitting stage clothes. His movements had naturally slowed as well, but there was something familiar the moment Willie opened his mouth. That unusually deep voice had aged with him, and he was still living in the Detroit area, remarkably close to where this whole story had begun roughly half a century earlier. His later life wasn't spent sitting at home watching old dramatics performances either. Willie continued working with versions of the group and appearing on the old-school soul circuit, where audiences who'd grown up with What You See Is What You Get and In the Rain could still hear one of the men who had actually recorded them. There was some unfinished business surrounding the group. After Ron Banks died in 2010, disagreements over who had the right to use the dramatics name resurfaced, and Willie became involved because of his long history with the group. But unlike Larry Demps, whose later story is much more closely connected to that legal fight, the dispute wasn't what defined Willie's final chapter. Something happening inside his own family was much more personal. His son, Willie Ford III, had followed him into music. Willie III performed with the Dramatics and learned the business directly from his father. That changed what those later performances meant. Willie had entered this world as a young man around 1969. Decades later, he could stand beside his own son and pass along things no music school could really teach: the harmonies, the stagecraft, and what it actually took to survive decades in the business. His son later described Willie as his mentor and credited him with teaching him both music and professionalism. So even as Willie grew older, he never completely disconnected from the life that had made him famous. Then his health started becoming a more serious problem. Willie Ford III later explained that his father had been suffering from health issues and had undergone surgery not long before his death. Reliable contemporary reports don't provide enough detail to responsibly turn that into a more specific diagnosis, but it was clear that the older Willie was no longer simply dealing with the ordinary physical changes fans could see on stage. On May 28, 2019, Willie Ford died in Detroit. He was 68 years old. The news meant the Dramatics had lost another voice from the lineup behind their defining early 1970s records. Ron Banks had already been gone for 9 years, and now the enormous bass that once sat beneath Ron's falsetto was gone too. But Willie left something unusually tangible behind. His son was already carrying part of what his father had taught him. That makes the final years of Willie Ford very different from those of some of the other men who passed through the Dramatics. He didn't spend them desperately trying to recreate his 20s. He kept performing the music, watched another generation of his own family enter it, and remained connected to Detroit until the end. For Elbert "Vamp" Wilkins, the cruel part was that success finally came, and then almost immediately began pulling everything apart. He had been with the Dramatics since their early Detroit years, and by 1971, at only 24, the bearded young baritone was finally standing behind a genuine hit when What You See Is What You Get reached number 3 R&B and number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100. His rougher voice and restless energy gave the harmonies some muscle. But just as the years of struggling were beginning to pay off, Elbert was about to walk away from the group he'd helped build. By the last year of his life, Elbert was only 45, yet those early Dramatics photographs already belonged to a world more than 2 decades behind him. The thick, dark beard and youthful face had changed, and he was no longer the energetic 20-something audiences had watched during the group's breakthrough. More importantly, he wasn't spending 1992 touring as part of the famous Dramatics lineup. His connection to that success had been broken years earlier. And strangely enough, the trouble had started when things were going well. After the success of What You See Is What You Get, tensions developed within the lineup. William Ouiji Howard left, and Elbert went with him. Instead of simply becoming 2 former members looking for another job, however, they assembled another lineup and continued performing under the Dramatics name. Suddenly there were competing Dramatics. That couldn't last. The dispute over the name eventually reached court, and the lineup containing Ron Banks, Larry Demps, and Willie Ford retained the right to use the Dramatics. Elbert and Ouiji therefore had to continue under another name, A Dramatic Experience. But losing the name didn't immediately end Elbert's career. He and the new group kept recording, and in 1975, No Rebate on Love climbed to number 26 on Billboard's R&B chart. For a man who'd walked away from one successful group, that wasn't a bad second chance. It proved Elbert could still make a record people wanted to hear. The problem was what happened next. A Dramatic Experience never developed into anything approaching the commercial force the Dramatics became. Meanwhile, Elbert's old group continued with new members, including L.J. Reynolds and Lenny Mays, recording and touring under the name he'd once helped establish. So Elbert spent much of his later musical life outside the act most listeners still associated him with. There are stories online portraying those years as a complete personal collapse, financial ruin, a destroyed marriage, and desperate performances simply to survive. But reliable documentation for those claims is thin, so they shouldn't be treated as fact. What can be established is simpler. Elbert's post-Dramatics project never matched the success or longevity of the group he'd left, and he didn't have decades to engineer another comeback. On December 13, 1992, Elbert "Vamp" Wilkins suffered a heart attack in Marshall, Michigan, and died. He was only 45 years old. That number is what makes his then and now transformation hit hardest. Elbert wasn't an elderly former soul singer looking back on the distant 1960s. He'd joined the Dramatics as a young man, reached the national top 10 at 24, left almost immediately afterward, tried to build another group, and barely 2 decades after his biggest record, he was already gone. Imagine seeing one of the Dramatics' original members years later and finding him behind the wheel of a freight truck instead of standing behind a microphone. That was Roderick Davis. Back in 1964, he was there before the hits, before the matching stage clothes became famous, and before most of America even knew the Dramatics existed. With his stockier build, slicked hair, and deep bass underneath those early harmonies, Roderick helped shape the group heard on records like Bingo and later All Because of You. By the later years of his life, however, almost everything around him had changed. Roderick was living in New Jersey, far removed from the Detroit stages of his youth. The carefully styled young singer had become an older working man with shorter graying hair, and music was no longer how he earned his living. Instead, Davis spent years working as a truck driver, with accounts of his later life connecting him to companies including National Freight and Wheaton Industries. He also had something much more ordinary waiting for him away from the road: his wife, Shirley A. Davis, and their family. For somebody who had once been positioned at the beginning of a promising Detroit vocal group, that sounds like an incredible career change. But Roderick hadn't simply woken up one morning and decided show business wasn't for him. Something happened when he was only 21 that helps explain why the young man in those Dramatics photographs eventually disappeared from the stage. On July 25, 1967, Roderick was at Detroit's Algiers Motel along with fellow Dramatics singer Larry Reed and the group's 18-year-old valet, Fred Temple. Police entered the motel annex following reports of gunfire, and Davis later described being subjected to a terrifying interrogation. He said an officer took him into a room, forced him down, and fired a weapon nearby as part of what amounted to a mock execution. Roderick survived the night. Fred Temple didn't. Temple was shot and killed, while historical accounts describe Davis as having been severely beaten during the ordeal. Afterward, the musical future that had looked so promising began slipping away. Roderick eventually left the Dramatics, and Willie Ford took over the bass position that Davis had once occupied. From there, their lives went in completely different directions. Willie would be there when the Dramatics became nationally famous in the early 1970s. Roderick instead built an adult life largely outside show business, eventually trading the microphone and touring schedule for long-distance trucking and family life in New Jersey. He died there in April 2007, and that's where Roderick's story should end. And after all those different paths, It's hard to believe these men once stood together as young singers from Detroit, hoping for one record that might change everything. Some stayed with the Dramatics for decades. Others walked away just as success arrived, and several never lived long enough to grow old with the music they helped create. Which Dramatics member surprised you the most then and now? And whose story do you think deserved a happier ending? Let us know in the comments and subscribe for more stories about the singers and groups you grew up with. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.